A couple of years ago, when it became apparent that we were going to get to be 150 years old as a society, I realised that somebody was going to have to start looking at the transactions which we published every year since 1875. This is no small task. Those of you who've ever looked at them will understand, and they are online, so they're easy enough to find. And as I looked through them, I became increasingly fascinated with the way that our founders, the Victorians and the Edwardians, set about their view of the natural world and their ideas about natural history, and how that compared with the things that we do today as natural historians, as members of this society. And that's jolly good, because it gets me out of having to cover anything between about 1919 and 1995, although there are a little bit in there anyway. So this is a partial history talk that I'm now going to present to you. And so yes, what I'm going to do is look at the founders and the origins of the society, and then I'm going to contrast their way of doing things and the means that they had for doing it, and the way we do things in the present day, as it were. Now, I did think about dressing up for the occasion. However, I quickly realised I was going to be outsmarted on this one today. Thank you, High Sheriff. So all you're getting is an AI-generated slide. My daughter, who's very techie about these things, I showed it to her for her approval, and she said she thought it was really very nice. And then about 10 seconds later, she said, "Oh my God, it's supposed to be you, isn't it?" Which tells you probably something you need to know about AI. I'm going to talk about AI later. Anyway, why not? Let's imagine that it's the 23rd of January, 1875. You have all gathered here. There's actually more than 60 of you here, but there were 60 ladies and gentlemen who assembled in Watford Library to establish what was then called the Watford Natural History Society and Hertfordshire Field Club. It was renamed after just 4 years as Hertfordshire Natural History Society and Field Club. You'll be glad to know that subscriptions, which you all agreed to, I have to say, were set at 10 shillings for the year, which is, anybody care to guess, in modern money, it's about £70 a year. So this was not a society that just anybody was going to join. And indeed, one of the other rules said that if you had to apply to be a member, and if you applied and enough members didn't like you, which was about a sixth, you could actually be blackballed from becoming a member. But there's no evidence of that ever having happened, I have to say. So there we go. The founders of the society, the two moving spirits of the society, one is Dr. Alfred Brett, who was a Watford doctor, local councillor, and also played a very important part in establishing a hospital in Watford as well. And John Hopkinson, who is an extremely important figure in terms of the history of the society. He came from a family of London piano makers. Here comes the pun. He was instrumental in the society's early success, and he served for very long periods as Honourable Secretary, as editor of the Transactions, indeed until his death in 1919, and he was also for 2 years President. Hopkinson also cultivated links both nationally and internationally with like-minded learned societies, which is what we all are here, and through the British Association for the Advancement of Science in particular. And he lived at various times in both Watford and St Albans. And it was estimated after his death that he'd actually contributed about 1/3 of the entire transactions of the society during his time as editor. I think Stuart knows how that feels, Stuart Warrington. The first president, John Evans. This is a good trick, isn't it? Nephew and son-in-law of the Hertfordshire paper entrepreneur, John Dickinson. But he was also, as well as being a manager at the Dickinson paper mill, which he was still a partner of in 1885, he then went on to become curator of Oxford's Ashmolean Museum, which housed his very large collection of Paleolithic stone tools and other implements, for he was indeed an eminent expert in geology and archaeology. He went on to become professor at Oxford University. He's regarded as the father of prehistoric archaeology in Britain. and was knighted indeed. But it is a really remarkable example, I think, together with John Hopkinson as well, of how an amateur scientist in those days could still lead the way in national and international science. I think you'll probably recognise this next gentleman, Charles Darwin. He gets his picture here. Alfred Russel Wallace doesn't, I'm afraid, but both absolutely crucial to the theory of evolution through natural selection. Hopkinson and Alfred Brett, and indeed others, though by no means all leading figures in the Natural History Society, were huge admirers of Darwin, and his work in those days was still very controversial, and the theories that were published in The Origin of Species and The Descent of Man were extremely controversial. I have to say there's no evidence that Darwin ever travelled to meet the Hertfordshire Natural History Society's founders, but he did graciously accept honorary membership of the society at a very early stage, and then Alfred Russel Wallace subsequently. So, I've introduced the individuals early as evidence of the society's serious scientific credentials. And it was led by individuals whose combination of knowledge, curiosity, and I think it has to also be said private means, made them leading figures of their time. And it's in that context we can turn to the Society's 1875 laws, they were described as laws, to see what the core business was of the first members. And it was actually, much like today, in some ways, many ways, to investigate the living world and to record and to share their sightings, which they did actively, not least amongst themselves at their meetings. So the formal language says it's about meteorology, geology, botany and zoology of the neighbourhood of Watford in the county of Hertford. However, in 1894, they expanded the terms of reference, which could be taken as a sign of how well they were doing. But they certainly went pretty ambitious at this point. So here again we have the investigation of meteorology, geology, botany, zoology, ethnology now makes an entrance, pre-Norman archaeology, thank you Sir John Evans, and topography, because there was a great expert on Hertfordshire maps who was a member of the society, Sir George Fordham of Onsey near Royston. So topography got in, the topography of Hertfordshire, and then secondly, the publication of results of their investigations, which is something we still stick to this day very much, and the dissemination. But here at the bottom, goodness me, we've got physics and biology as well. So it's a pretty hefty slice of the living world by that point that they were actively concerned with, or thought they were anyway. Compare that with our own aims and objectives of today. And I think this is admirably succinct. Promoting the study and recording of the flora and fauna of Hertfordshire, encouraging a wider interest in natural history, including conservation of wildlife habitats and geological features, for the purpose of environmental protection or improvement. Firstly, I just want to suggest, I think, the continuing sense of serious scientific purpose is there in this modern day iteration. There's a continuing interest in studying the living world, recording sightings and discoveries. But secondly, what we also have is a much simpler but yet much more strategic account of the Society's role. And I think that dates from the 1990s recognition that the Natural History Society needed to find its niche in the modern world. So there are the continuities and there are also the differences. So, as I'm sure you know perfectly well, the Natural History Society encourages all of you to look proactively for wildlife and record. It manages the network of expert county recorders who verify the records and create the wildlife and the reliable data, and it analyses the trends and publishes that information, not least through the atlases and indeed on the website. And I'll talk a little bit more about that towards the end of this talk. And we do this strategically because we live in a world, I think, where each passing year testifies to the intensification of climate change, as Nicholas was saying earlier. We have existential threats to our wildlife habitats and to biodiversity. We have species extinctions, indeed, and we have all the many other environmental challenges that confront our planet in a way that they didn't, or certainly the Victorians were not aware that they did. So, my central theme for this talk really is that as natural historians, there's a question of what it is that we choose to study under the banner of natural history, and that I think is shaped very much by our contemporary scientific concerns and enthusiasms concerning the living world. It's defined, as it always must be, by the limits to current scientific knowledge. And it also very much depends, I think, and this is something that comes out clearly in the transactions of our society, it very much depends on what tools we have available to us at the time that actually enable us to pursue our investigations. So let's start with these tools. A fine collection of Victorian brass microscopes, which were commercially produced. They were available at a price that people who could afford 10 shillings to be our members could probably afford a microscope as well. And so it was an important thing for the early work of the society. The field meetings went out to gather material to be shaved and then displayed on microscope slides, and plants, insects and rock shavings were particularly prized. And this, which was an exhibit in the exhibition in St Albans Museum earlier this year, is a collection of these very beautifully constructed microscope slides from, I think it was F.W. Phillips, from exactly that period that were exhibited, and they had the microscopes available at the meetings of the society. We don't have any microscopes here today, I'm afraid. John Hopkinson in particular, but many of the others, a lot of them were fellows of the Royal Meteorological Society indeed, and they're absolutely committed to collecting rainfall and other weather data. This is a collection here of copper rain gauge instruments, and they collected the results, they collated them, they published tables and regular assessments of Hertfordshire's climate. And I suppose when it only takes a few computer clicks nowadays to obtain very sophisticated global weather forecasts being continuously updated with data from satellites, it's quite hard to imagine the extensive time and commitment that the founding Natural History Society members devoted to these things. But if you look in the transactions, you will find there are page after page after page of tables of rainfall data and other meteorological data, often in articles contributed by Hopkinson himself. And they are still important in their way as historic records, even though in trying to read the transactions we probably slip through them rather quickly nowadays. Those of you who like trains, here's a railway engine. I believe it's a Midland Line engine, so it has some relevance to this. But the Natural History Society actually chartered trains in the beginning to go out and make as the start point of their field meetings. They also used horse-drawn carriages to transport them. Happily, the fact that there were railways meant there were railway cuttings being there and still being created, as well as chalk pits, which created wonderful opportunities to study chalk scenery and geological strata and find fossils. And then if you were doing that and trying to get from your carriage to the chalk pit, you could complete the trip on foot, which gave the botanists and the fungi enthusiasts their opportunity to study their specialist subject. In 1899, some members were still reaching field meetings by carriage, others by train, but the bicycle was also popular by then. Hopkinson blithely noted that after one field meeting, the stream of cyclists, 16 in number, the majority being ladies, was a pretty sight. In 1902, there was a lecture by Lewis Evans, son of Sir John, and he predicted a great future for the automobile. As soon as it has undergone a chastening improvement in its details, accompanied by an enormous reduction in its prime cost. The first trip by motor bus was in 1911, yes. Now, how to identify birds and mammals. Oh, sorry, I'm so shocked by my slide that well, in the absence of today's largely affordable but certainly high-powered and light binoculars, as illustrated here, that there was an overlap between science and hunting and shooting in the early Natural History Society, which actually did number self-proclaimed sportsmen among its members. So they shot and asked identification questions later. And probably Hertfordshire's most celebrated natural historian of the era, the Honourable Walter Rothschild of Tring, kindly sent the Society a list of 21 birds new to Hertfordshire, they included, he'd shot them himself by the way, they included an alleged short-toed lark that he'd shot as food for his tame owl. The Honourable Walter later became president of the Society, although he did turn down the job of bird recorder, which is probably a good thing because his two most remarkable and enduring records have been deleted in the 20th century as being unreliable, including the short-tailed lark. The other one's one that Ken Smith got rid of, which is a marsh sandpiper. There we go. Anyway, this is an era anyway which we have anecdotal reports of nightingales being shot by game keepers on the grounds that they disturb the game birds at night. Photography. Why did they shoot birds rather than shoot them with a camera like we do today? Well, the camera was a bit unwieldy at that stage in its development, and indeed the first lecture on photography was in 1892, introducing dry plate photography. As you can see, the camera was a rather unwieldy, heavy thing. It wasn't certainly very flexible, and it required a tripod. One thing that I do like, though, about this particular period is the use of the magic lantern, because they did have the overhead projector, or the slide projector, which was an oxyhydrogen contraption. Unfortunately, I haven't got one here today. I had one in St Albans at the museum, which was a great thing. But it required gas bags of oxygen and hydrogen, separate bags, to get it going. And there are a great many stories, that happily not from the HNHS, of these things exploding in the attempt to get them going. But there was wild excitement for the Natural History Society members when they were shown a lantern slide of the plasmodium phase of a slime mould. Those of you know about slime moulds, which I didn't really, but they do swing during the plasmodium state, they move, and the one under the magic lantern very obligingly moved in front of the audience. They were very, very excited about it. You can see the problem with photography in this area, because this is the first photograph of an HNHS field meeting in 1893. Hopkinson called it Hertfordshire Conglomerate, because it's a geology meeting, and it's a joke. It's got it, thank you, Alex. The other thing I derive from this is the possibility of some move in the near future to make top hats, bowlers and boaters compulsory for all meetings of the Society. So please look out for that one. Geology and botany, which fungi were then considered a part of much the most popular early study areas, both indoors and out. I'm not sure I've got the slide of it here, but the first close-up photo of a bird, it wasn't that close-up, was of a grey wagtail. That didn't appear until 1914 in the transactions, and I showed it to an RSPB group recently, and it really, well, you could see it was a grey wagtail, but it was extremely grainy. Not a great photograph. So, more technology. Cheap printing had actually been around for more than 50 years by the time the society started, and one of the consequences is that we have this wonderful unbroken series of reports from 1875 until the present day, and it is one of the Society's greatest and most enduring achievements. Just as an indication of the breadth of topics covered by the Society in this era, before 1900, this is a sort of summary table. So we've got the physical sciences, the meteorology, the hydrogeology, the geology, the phenology, which I will come back to later, biology, botany, and all that that entails, zoology and all that that entails, archaeology, and a great many miscellaneous topics, including Hopkinson's near-annual reports from the British Association for the Advancement of Science. It's an impressive range and really does show the breadth of the Society's interest in these first 25 years. Early membership peaked at around 280, and that was in the 1880s, and then fell back to around 200 by the turn of the century. And there was someone who had been a young member in 1907 who, looking back, I think from about 40 years further, wrote in the Transactions that he felt that the Society by that time had become inactive beyond its leading figures, who were still active, and was degenerating into a mutual admiration society. I'm now going to look at some of the prominent figures of the early Society, and yes, I mean the first committee included an Earl, an Admiral, 2 clergymen, no women, and indeed there was no woman on the management committee until after the First World War, when a lady called Charlotte Cooper became the first member of the committee. But what I want to do here is to introduce you to Edward Hyde-Villiers, the 5th Earl of Clarendon, aide-de-camp to Queen Victoria, who was a president of the Society. Anyway, he gave this really rather extraordinary presidential address in 1890, in which he was talking about field sports and their bearing on the national character. And in this he declared his conviction that hunting and shooting were bulwarks against male effeminacy and deterioration. To which he added, it is not murderous instinct or a love of slaughter which activates those who take part in the sports of the field, the pursuit of which has tended in no inconsiderable degree to make English men manly, brave and self-reliant. Did I say Charlotte Cooper was an expert on fungi and bryophytes? Anyway, she joined the committee in 1919. Let's move on to a more serious scientist, Eleanor Ormerod, the first woman recorder for Hertfordshire. She also had private means. She was self-taught in her interest on insects, and she became a national and indeed international authority on what were described as injurious pests. The Transactions in 1878 included her notes on economic entomology, which were quite forward-looking as well, because they included a pro forma that farmers and others could fill in about agricultural pests, and they were provided with line drawings of the pests for identification purposes as well. Possibly her finest Hertfordshire hour came when she hastened, in 1886 this was, by horse and carriage to a farm near Hertford to identify the pupae of the Hessian fly, which is rather splendidly then called Cecidomyia destructa. It's now Myetiola destructa. It was an introduced species. It had already caused absolutely massive destruction to cereals in the USA. Eleanor published prompt advice to British farmers, reassuring them that their existing autumn sowing times were likely to prevent mass infection, but she also suggested ways of combating any infestation that did occur. She's also celebrated for having once investigated the toxic properties of the skin of great crested newts. She did this by putting one between her teeth, and the result was much foam and violent spasmodic action around her mouth, followed by a persistent headache and shivering. She was a great character. I don't think her views on exterminating all house sparrows would have won her many friends nowadays. And she was also a great friend of an insecticide called Paris Green, which had a very large arsenic component. But a wonderful leading figure. And then we also, Peter in the annual report mentioned the book collection, the historic book collection that Alfred Pryor bequeathed to the Society. He also worked on the Society's first flora of Hertfordshire until his premature death. He was just 42 when he died. And as you heard, the rare books go back to the 15th century. The one you can see here in the picture is from the 16th century, and it's De Historia Stirpium Commentarii in Signes, 1542, Leonhard Fuchs of Bavaria. And it's wonderfully hand-coloured, and I'm so glad we managed to get it on display in St Albans during the exhibition, along with others. If you're looking for a more familiar approach, shall we say, to recording, then you need look no further than our spider recorder of the 19th century, our first F.M. Campbell, Frank Moore Campbell. He published the first county checklist of 196 species in 1883, all of which he'd found just in the neighbourhood of his home in Hodston. And he also published good advice on searching for spiders in the field. He wrote on other natural history topics as well, very authoritatively. And it's interesting, I think, that after he left Hertfordshire, only 9 more species, spider species, were added to the list in the half century that followed. However, should you look for Frank Moore Campbell in Wikipedia, you won't find anything about this, but you will find that he was, as a callow youth, I think he was about 19, 20, he was one of the founders of the Football Association. He was a member of Blackheath Rugby Football Club, terrible mistake there, because he then, having helped found the Football Association, he was then part of the breakaway by rugby football as well. So that's what he's chiefly famous for, not spiders, I'm afraid. It's David Carr here. Do you play rugby? No. Arthur Ernest Gibbs, St Albans printer and newspaper editor, amateur expert on mosses and liverworts, a leading figure in the campaign that the Society launched to establish a county museum in Hatfield Road, St Albans. He donated his own very large collection of butterflies, moths and other insects, and curated it as well as a voluntary activity. He had the double distinction of becoming both the Secretary and President of the Society, which was subsequently equalled by his daughter Eileen. I'm afraid I don't have time to include Eileen in this talk, but she was another remarkable figure of the Society of the 20th century. You wouldn't guess from looking at this picture, but Arthur Stradling was a herpetologist. He was actually an international authority on snakes and lizards, and he was also a Watford doctor. He went round the world collecting snakes for the London Zoo, and he kept some of them in his living room, which he also used as the waiting room for his surgery. So an early 20th century account of his work suggested that his patients didn't lack for diversion whilst waiting to see him. And he also injected himself with venom to see if it helped to give him immunity to snakebite. Rather sadly, he, after hosting a summer visit to the London Zoo by members of the Hertfordshire Natural History Society, the members were dismayed to hear that he had died just a few weeks later. And according to the transactions, he was subject to frequent attacks of fever contracted when studying nature in tropical and malarious countries, and shortly after this meeting, to the regret of his many friends and admirers, his health completely broke down. Very recent research tells us actually what happened was that he died from an overdose of cocaine and morphine. He'd been trying to self-medicate himself against the pain of sciatica. So it's a sad story, it ends badly. The emblem of the Heartbird Club. If you were to ask what else the Natural History Society achieved in these early years, that was really a solid conservation achievement, it would have to be this. And indeed, in spite of all the shooting that went on, was still going on, they started off with a rule in the Society's rules that said the Society shall discourage the practice of removing rare plants, and of exterminating rare birds, fish and other animals, and shall use its influence with landowners and others for the protection of the characteristic birds of the county. The rarer botanical specimens collected at field meetings shall be chiefly such as can be gathered without disturbing the roots of the plants, and notes on the habits of birds shall be accumulated instead of specimens either of the birds or their eggs. Well, about 5 years after the Society was founded, we had a groundbreaking piece of legislation, the Wild Birds Protection Act of 1880. The HNHS lobbied the County Council and Parliament for a Hertfordshire specific ban on killing particular species, and there was also a schedule of birds whose eggs it became illegal to take or destroy, and this included nightjar, kingfisher, grebes, owls and woodpeckers. Let's just go back quickly to remind you, this is the breadth of topics covered towards the getting on for the First World War, as it were. Just another look at how wide it is, because I'm now going to jump forward more than a century to the modern day Natural History Society. What was it that happened in the 20th century to make things so different today? Well, I think the most important word is specialisation. Increasing professionalisation of scientific research as well, and the advancement, gradually but necessarily, specialisation supplanted the role of amateur experts like the Society's founders, and indeed the rapidly expanding knowledge concerning the natural world also served to nudge the amateurs as well as the professionals towards that increased specialisation. And I hope you're enjoying the IBM mainframe computer from 1965 as a reminder of how exciting the 20th century was. I'm thankful we are not to have to use those things for our computing anymore. When the Society celebrated its centenary 50 years ago, strangely enough, the Rothamsted plant pathologist Philip Gregory, who was also a leading figure in the Society, and therefore had a foot in both camps, talked about this specialisation that had been taking place during the 20th century, and asked the question, is there still a place for natural history performed by volunteers and amateurs? And I think it's a lovely quote. He said, he was talking in terms of his own time, but modern biology is specialised, moreover needs expensive equipment, scanning electron microscopes, there's such a thing, gas chromatography, computers, but to see nature whole, alive and interacting, we realise that we need the Natural History Society as well as our more specialist societies. So, in terms of the way the Natural History Society has become specialised in its modern era, Hayden, in receiving his richly well-deserved Trevor Jones Award, alluded to the fact that it's now 50 years since the Hertfordshire Geological Society was established as a separate group, actually within the Natural History Society to begin with, although it became autonomous in 2002. But in Hertfordshire we also have specialist groups that are dedicated to the study of birds, flora, invertebrates, dragonflies, butterflies, moths, amphibians and reptiles, bats and badgers. It's only the first three of these that actually operate within the Hertfordshire Natural History Society, and the others, although linked very much by overlapping membership and regular collaboration, are actually independent organisations. Increased interest in conserving as well as studying wildlife underpinned a drive that the Natural History Society itself led to create from 1963 a professionally staffed body tasked with conserving wildlife and key habitats. And so the Herts and Middlesex Trust for Wildlife Conservation, which is today's HMWT, set about acquiring and managing nature reserves, advising landholders on conservation, campaigning for biodiversity, and engaging in public education on a scale that the Society could never have contemplated doing with its volunteer leadership and membership. We have HERC, which we also heard about already today, which manages the biological and habitat data from across the county and makes the data available for use in nature conservation, but also when questions of development, planning and research come up, and indeed wider public policy at national level too. And just to remind you about the 3.993 million, nearly 4 million records, the majority contributed by members of the Natural History Society. And also just worth mentioning that the first director of HERC, I'm sure many of you know this, was the late Trevor James. It started under the auspices of the Hertfordshire County Council. It's now housed at HNWT. So, the niches that we would claim for ourselves today are listed there, and I've referred to most of them, I think, the recording, the verification, the monitoring groups, the surveys, which we've heard about today, conferences and lectures that we're actually sitting in at the moment, publication of the publication of the transactions, the atlases that have been published using the information gathered, the website, which is very important, and even the occasional exhibition, I believe. But the Society decided, in response to a generally welcome expansion of outdoor activities relating to wildlife, to stop organising its own field trips, other than those that are carried out by the specialist organisations within the Society and outside. And groups like the British Naturalists Association, Hearts Branch, and all the local RSP groups organise great programmes of field trips. So it's one thing we probably don't need to do as well. And here are the beautiful atlases. The first one was the Moths of Hertfordshire by Colin Plant, and you can see some of them sadly no longer available. We no longer have the Flora of Hertfordshire in print, I'm afraid. The great thing about the birds and the butterflies is that it's not the first survey that they're reporting on, so trend data from previous surveys can be gathered, and the atlases provide really striking and valuable examples of species fluctuations in response to global warming and other environmental changes. And as we've also heard today, the series includes a definitive guide to geology and landscape in Hertfordshire. And this is wonderful because geology doesn't go out of date like the other ones do. But Colin Plant, previously mentioned, whose Moths of Hertfordshire Atlas was published in 2008, has much more recently been active in converting the Herts and Middlesex Moths Group's website into a living atlas. In place of his beautiful but now outdated book, we have a website whose species information, including distribution maps, can be updated in real time. And this is an approach that seems likely over time, I think, to be embraced for other taxa. Trevor James played a significant part in the move away from types and handwritten card index records, of which he was a careful exponent, of course, into online databases using standard software and towards national data sharing. And the sophistication and power of these websites, such as the Biological Record Centre's iRecord and the BTO's Bird Track, is such that Hertfordshire records can now be entered by individuals and travel back down the system to reach the county recorders, and indeed HERC as well. And the equipment would amaze our Victorian forebears, I'm sure. Light-sensitive trail cameras photographing wildlife in front of them are a pretty old hat actually now, but they're commonplace certainly. Electronic transmitter tags in bird and other research means we can now receive records of birds that have visited Hertfordshire that no one ever actually saw. We likewise have sound recording, so-called knock-me microphones being recorded at night, identifying overflying species, and indeed, yes, we find sea ducks fly over Hertfordshire and things like that. We have the artificial intelligence apps, smartphone apps. They're not dependable yet for serious biological recording, but they already provide an experienced observer with useful prompts, and they're fun for leisure use too. And their accuracy is actually going to improve for sure. I won't tell you a learning anecdote just to save time. Ask me afterwards if you want. And then we have this higher level with the theoretical potential to identify, well, any living species on Earth, which is the burgeoning science of DNA sampling. This too at the moment depends for accuracy on the quality and the extent of its comparison databases needed to produce matches that carry a convincingly high level of statistical probability. In Hertfordshire, an amateur naturalist with a scientific background called Adam Hilliers leading a community science project to extract short sections of DNA barcode from an array of samples working at Bayfordbury. They're using low-cost kits prepared for non-specialists to carry out DNA extraction. The work's completed by professional technicians who tell them what was in the material. For example, an example of the material would be work on the diet of bats based on examining the DNA from their droppings. And Adam lent me this slide that actually love, so everything up to 2010, Charles Darwin, great. Today, the things I've just described in DNA barcoding, 2030. Does anybody know what that piece of equipment that Mr. Spock is holding in Star Trek? Tricorder. Thank you. Mr. Spock's tricorder. Well, here is Trevor out in the field with his sweetnet, I think. A colleague, actually I think he's here today, I won't say who it is. I asked him recently, he's a very, very experienced naturalist, a lot of experience, and I asked him recently, how did he manage to operate in the era before we had sophisticated recorders? And he rather dryly replied to me, meticulous observation. So where does meticulous observation go in the era we're now entering? Well, one straightforward answer is to acknowledge a continuing need for experienced, knowledgeable humans who can not only generate their own reliable records, but also understand the how and the why of the technology and why it produces its results. We need people as well who can tell us when their AI results are just improbable or plain wrong. But another response, which is, I suppose, aesthetic rather than scientific, is really just horror at the thought that the human appreciation of birdsong or a wildflower could ever be reduced to a matter of pointing a smartphone at it, rather like Mr. Spock's tri-recorder that analysed all life on the planet. I'm sure, having said that, the county recorders and anyone whose priority is knowing what's out there will welcome the part that AI and DNA analysis can play in telling us what is out there. But there's still a point and a need for people such as ourselves, as volunteer members of the society. I was going to just mention the fact that some things in the past are still studied in the present, like there was a suggestion that we should have beavers introduced in the 19th century, and the Bourne gutter, which is a wonderful thing, Winterbourne, is studied vigorously to this day. Phenology, finally, I promise it's finally. The study of seasonal change in plants and animals. It was studied for more than 40 years at the beginning of the Society's life. First and last appearances of 24 species on standard list determined by the Meteorological Society, included the flowering of common tree shrubs, wildflowers, migrant birds, appearance of honeybees, wasps and butterflies. It was regarded by some as the glue that held the Society together, and yet a number of contributors dropped off. Hopkinson died and they stopped doing it, possibly because things didn't change enough to make it really interesting. Well, now we live in an era of global warming and climate change, when things are changing very rapidly indeed, and phenology is making something a comeback. There is this report shown on the slide. The Met Office published with the Woodland Trust, which was about a study of bud bursts on trees and how that was moving earlier in the year. in response to climate change. So I would say that looking back and thinking that Hertfordshire Natural History Society can still learn from its 150-year-old past while looking forward with confidence to its future is probably a good place to end this talk.